All right, we're ready for Ezekiel chapters 4 to 6. In our study, we introduced the book of Ezekiel last time and looked at chapters 1 to 3. Here is the outline we're following on the book of Ezekiel. 3 sections to the book. We'll see this each time, and hopefully you'll get familiar with this if you're not already. The chapters 1 to 24 deals with judgment on Jerusalem. Then we have a nations section, as we often do in the prophets, 25 to 32. And then the restoration section of God's people, 33 to 48. Much parallel in structure to the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah as well, but particularly Isaiah. That outline is adapted from Baxter and Wiersbe. So in chapters 1 to 3, we saw his call to be a prophet, and God told him that I'm going to send you to a people that are disobedient. They will not listen to you, but you go preach to them anyway. And he gave him the charge of being a watchman and told him that a watchman's job was to go tell them the truth. They may not listen. If they don't, at least you saved your own soul. And if they do listen, you save them and yourself as well. So we're ready for this section, chapters 4 through 7. We're only going to go through verse 6 tonight. We'll pick up with verse 7. But as per this outline, 4 through 7 deals with a disobedient nation. This is the nation to whom you have been sent. Here's what's going to happen to them, number 1. Here's why that's going to happen to them, number 2. Those 2 things we're going to see. It's going to be vividly pictured through this chapter. If you haven't already read 4 to 6, the consequence of their action and what their action was, and then here's the consequence, how the city is going to be devastated. Now remember, let's go back to an introductory thought, and that is where this book fits in time. And that is Ezekiel went in the second group. Remember, they went away in 3 groups. There was the first group that went into captivity, and Daniel was in that group. And then there was the second group, and Ezekiel is in this group that goes. So the third and final group is yet to come. And so there were false prophets in Jerusalem as well as in captivity that were saying, this prophecy of Jeremiah that Jerusalem is going to fall will never happen. It's not going to happen. Egypt will spare us. It's not going to happen. Jerusalem is not going to fall. And yet Ezekiel points out here that it is going to fall. The city is going to be besieged. And he's vividly picturing that, particularly in chapter 4. And does in chapter 5 as well, and tells them why that's going to happen. And when that comes to pass, then they'll know that indeed he is the Lord. So we're focusing on this disobedient nation. 3 things we're going to see tonight. First of all, we start with the 4 symbolic parables that portray Jerusalem's fall. So here is a vivid, colorful picture painted in 4 different scenes, though they overlap. And when I say they overlap, some were ongoing at the same time. Now, we'll start with the first one, and if you're following and keeping up with the handout, you be watching for what did the prophet do in the sign, and secondly, what does that mean? What's the significance of that? So what we have in chapter 4 are symbolic actions. Some commentators argue that these 4 things were just done in a vision. I don't think so. I think he literally did these events, such as having the clay tablet, etc. But be that as it may, even if it was in a vision, the point is ultimately the same when we get to the end of that. But I do think he actually did this. And the reason I think he did this was supposed to be a sign to Israel or to Judah, to those in captivity. It was supposed to be a message to them. So you think about the events, if you've read ahead, concerning the city besieged, and the prophet lying on his side, eating the polluted bread and cutting his hair and shaving, that when he does those things, that makes an impression on the people and causes them to ask, why? What are you doing here with this model city that you have? Gives them an excellent opportunity to explain. What are you doing laying on your side? What's that all about? Why are you laying there every day for 390 days? And then you turn on the other side for 4. Why are you doing that, Ezekiel? Gives them a chance to explain. Why'd you cut your hair? And what are you doing with these 3 different groups of hair that you've sorted out? And you put some inside your garment. Why'd you do that? And so those kinds of questions would obviously be raised by the children of Israel who watched the prophet and their priest do this. So let's work through these. Here's the first of the four. Let's take verses 1 to 3. The sign of a city besieged. So, having been called to be the prophet, here's the first thing that he does. You also, son of man, take a clay tablet and lay on it and before you and portray on it the city of Jerusalem. So I take it that it's a clay tile. Some refer to that as a tile. Take a clay tile and he draws up on it a city, the city of Jerusalem. And so how big this was, we're not told, but it's something significant enough that he can draw upon it, and he draws upon it the city of Jerusalem. And then he sits back and, as in a mock war, he lays siege against that. Perhaps drawing on the tile, or maybe in some other fashion, he begins to do some things, like he said, lay siege against it, and build a siege wall against it, and heap up a mound. So heaping up mounds to ramp into the city. So mound you up some mock ramps, some mounds to go into the city, set camps against it, and draw that on your clay tablet, and place battering rams all around it. You may not be familiar with battering rams. This is a picture of a battering ram that would be rolled up to the city. Some refer to this at the top of as being a bridge. I'm not sure that that's what they had, but some depictions here of battering rams to try to penetrate the wall. So you make this is a little model city, and over here is a battering ram right here, if you can tell, and where there's a mock war against this city. Perhaps it's that kind of thing that he is drawing or picturing going into the city, as if the city is being besieged. Now, verse 3 talks about an iron plate, or perhaps an iron griddle, perhaps a griddle that would be cooked upon. Take that iron plate and put it between you and the city in this mock war that you have drawn here on the tile. And set it as an iron between you and the city, and set your face against it, and it shall be besieged, and lay siege against it, and this will be a sign to the house of Israel. So what does the iron plate represent? Well, scholars differ just a little bit. They come out to the same end. Some suggest that this iron plate, or this iron griddle, cooking griddle perhaps, suggests that there is a barrier that you have created between you and your God. Your own sin has raised up, and so God is not accessible to you because of this iron plate, this iron barrier between you and your God. Perhaps. That's what it's talking about. Others suggest that actually God is using this plate to protect the enemies, allowing the enemy then to attack. So he's behind this iron plate, he's attacking the city. He's laying a siege against the city. So that God is actually not protecting them from their enemy, but protecting the enemy from them, so that the enemy is able to besiege the city. The end point's still the same. There is something that is causing them, be it God himself or be it their own sin between them and their God, that's causing this problem of the besieging of the city. So that's the first sign. So the city is going to be besieged. The city is going to fall. There's going to be a war against the city. And he plays that out on this mock war. The second thing, beginning at verse 4, is the prophet lying on his side. That's the second sign. And so is this going on at the same time? A cursory reading of that may give us the impression that he does this mock war of the city on the map or on the tile. And then later he does, but it seems to be going on at the same time. Even the matter of the next two signs, all four of them, overlap to some degree. And so let's look at verses 4 through verse 8. The prophet lying on his side. He was told to lie on his left side and laid the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it. Let's pause just for a minute. If you follow McGuigan, some of you have McGuigan's work on Ezekiel. McGuigan makes the point that if you look up that expression found here in verse 4, lay the iniquity on, means you suffer the punishment of. So if the iniquity is laid upon him, you're suffering the punishment. So he's demonstrating suffering of the punishment. We'll say more about the significance of that in a moment. But according to the number of days you shall lie upon it, you shall bear the iniquity. So what does he do? Well, verse 5 said he lays on his left side for 390 days, and that represented the iniquity laid upon the house of Israel, the northern kingdom. Well, then at verse 6, then you turn over on the other side, on your right side, and you lay there for 40 days. And that represents the bearing of the iniquity of the house of Judah. And I have laid on you a day for each year. So each one of those days represented a year or stood for a year. So that comes to 430 years. And scholars then have played with those numbers and said, where does this all start? Does it start at 722 BC? And so that doesn't seem to work out too well for 430 years of punishment. And some think, well, maybe it starts a little bit later at the second invasion. And so what's the significance of the 430 years with reference to what date does it start? It has no significance with reference to that, I don't think. Let's go back for a moment to Exodus chapter 12. I think every Jew would have been familiar with this. In Leviticus chapter, not Leviticus, I think I said Exodus, but I should have said Exodus anyway. Exodus chapter 12 in verse 40 and 41. And that is, the children of Israel were in Egypt, verse 40 says, for 430 years. I think it's perhaps a play on that their captivity, their punishment was for 400, and they were punished, or they suffered for 430 years. So I think that's the significance of the 430 years, not that it is to be counted from 722 BC when Israel fell to Assyria, and then it's supposed to be for literally those many years. It's just the Egyptian captivity is symbolic of the Babylonian captivity. We know Babylonian captivity only lasted 70 years. And so I think that's the way we harmonize the 430 and the 70 years. But you're to do that. And so he's to be, notice at verse 8, that I will constrain you. And the footnote to the idea of constraining says, put ropes on you. In other words, he's going to be laying there on his side and tied up so that he's constrained. And so what's the idea of him being constrained? Well, he's unable to turn to the other side, suggesting he's pressed down and held in the grasp of punishment. And so people ask, what are you doing? Well, I'm bearing the iniquity of Israel. I'm bearing the iniquity of Judah. He's held down and he's bound. It's symbolic of the weight of the punishment that's coming because of their sin. And so the house of Israel, this house of Judah. Now, some have suggested maybe the 390 versus the 40 suggest that Israel was much worse, which it was, than Judah as far as their kings. Their kings were more wicked. They didn't have a good king at all in the northern Israel. That may be the significance, though I'm not sure of that. And so now, that seems to be going on at the same time that he's laying siege against the city. And so get the pictures. People come by and they see Ezekiel the priest and the prophet. What are you doing? What's this you've drawn? And it looks like you're attacking a drawing of a city or a mock city. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Why are you laying on your side and you're all tied up? Gives him an opportunity to tell exactly what's going on. Let's go to the third one now, and that's beginning at chapter 4 and verse 9, eating polluted bread. So he tells him, God tells him, take for yourself barley and beans and lentil and millet and spelt, and put them in one vessel and make bread from that. And during the number of the days that you lie on your side, that tells me these are overlapping. So during this time, you're going to eat this bread, and you're going to eat it. Now, at verse 10, the food's going to be rationed. You shall weigh it out, 20 shekels a day. From time to time, you shall eat it. In other words, about 8 to 10 ounces, barely above starvation level. So he's going to be eating, and he's eating ration portions. Then you shall eat, as you eat the barley cake, I've skipped verse 11. You shall drink water by measure 1/6 of a hin. From time to time, you shall drink. Well, scholars differ a little bit of how much that involved. Pulpit suggests it was either 6/10 or 9/10 of a pint. Barnes suggests something very similar to that. King suggests in his work that it was a pint and a third. Wasn't a lot either in any direction you go with that, whether you're talking about 6/10 or a pint and a third. Not a great deal of water. So the food and the water is rationed. There's limited supply. But I'm more interested in this fact. Look at verse 12. As you eat this, you're going to bake it using the fuel of human waste in their sight. Think how disgusting that is. That it was common to use cow dung as fuel in Palestine, but you're going to use, what I'm telling you to use is human dung. And you're going to cook your cake and your bread over that. So you go ahead and do that. Now, the Lord said, the children of Israel shall eat the defiled bread. You might underline it, verse 13. This is the key, what this is about. So the children of Israel shall eat bread defiled among the Gentiles where I'll drive them. They're going to be driven into captivity, and they're going to be eating defiled bread. Now, there's some question here, and I'll just throw the possibilities out. Some suggest that the bread itself wasn't defiled, but it was defiled because it was removed from Jerusalem, and it wouldn't be sanctified. McGuigan argues that, but it would be defiled if it was cooked over human dung, obviously. And so he objected to that, saying, I've never defiled myself and never eaten anything that died of itself or torn by the beast or any abominable flesh has never entered my mouth. I've never done that. And so God said, okay, I'll give you cow dung to do that with, and instead of human waste, and you prepare your bread over that. And I will cut off Jerusalem from the supply of bread from Jerusalem, he said, and they'll eat it by measure. And there'll be lack of bread and they'll waste away because of their iniquity. All right, what's the point? So the point of eating the polluted bread was to demonstrate that when you go into captivity, there's going to be ration food, and you're going to be eating defiled among the Gentiles. You're going to be eating defiled bread among the Gentiles. You can, just as a footnote, you can go to the store and buy Ezekiel bread in the store. And often it will say something like this loaf of bread here, that it'll say Ezekiel 4:9, the very passage we're reading, as the reference to the kind of bread they think they are selling. So anyway, that is demonstrating to them when people ask, what are you eating this bread? And didn't you cook that over cow dung over here? And what is this you're eating? And why are you eating so little? And it's telling them this is what's going to happen when they go into captivity. Those in Jerusalem are going to fall. All right, let's move further. We're ready for chapter 5, but we're still in the 4 symbolic parables. The fourth of these parables is the sign of the prophet's haircut. So he said, you take a sword, a sharp sword, and take it as a barber's razor. Take that sharp sword and use it as a razor, and pass it over your head and over your beard, and take the balance and divide your hair. So you cut your hair off, and you cut your beard, and you take that and you balance it out, and you weigh them out in equal amounts. They have 3 portions of that. All right? So at verse 2, take a third of it, and in the midst of the city, in the days of the siege, when the days of the siege are finished, and take a third and strike it on the ground. Let's start and talk about the first one. The first, you cast it in the midst of the fire, in the midst of the city. I take that to be his model city. So here's your model city, and while he's laying on his side, and when the days of the siege are ended, you take a third of your hair and you put it in the middle, and it's to be burned indeed with fire. Take another third, and he said, strike it with a sword. And that's going to raise some questions. What in the world, Ezekiel, are you doing? Cut your hair off, and you burn a third of it in the fire, and you take a third of it, and you're hacking it with a sword. And then take another third and scatter it to the wind. Don't you know they thought Ezekiel had lost his mind? What on earth are you doing? He's drawn a city. He's laying on his side, tied up, and then he turns over after 390 days, and he's on the other side, and he's eating ration portions of defiled bread. And then he cuts his hair off and divides it in 3 sections, and he burns some, he hacks some of it up, and then with a sword, and then he scatters the other to the wind. He's not done. He also takes a small portion, binds it in the edge of his garment, the text said. By the way, Leviticus 21, just for what it's worth to you, Leviticus 21:5 suggests that to a priest to shave his head and cut his hair off was repulsive to him. And indeed it was repulsive to Ezekiel. Now what's the point here of taking this and putting it in the garment? There's going to be a remnant left, and they're going to face trials. Now that's going to get us through the end of verse 4, and then we're ready to go to our second section. But let's get verse 4. And take some of them again and throw them in the midst of the fire. Some of this small portion that you had, you divide into 3 sections, but then there's a small portion of that you stick in your garment. And throw some of that into the fire. In other words, they're going to face some trials and tribulation and burn them in the fire. For from there a fire went out into all the house of Israel. So what's the point of that? Well, that's going to be explained to us at verse 12. So we're going to save a little bit of that explanation of the 4th at verse 12. But what it suggests is some are going to suffer pestilence, some are going to suffer the sword, and some are going to be scattered. There's going to be a remnant. And out of that remnant, some of them are going to face tribulation. And that's the point, and we'll see that at verse 12. All right, there are the 4 parables now that to portray Jerusalem's fall. The sign of the besieged city, him lying on his side, eating polluted bread. He well illustrates his point. He gives a vivid picture. Now, when we get to chapter 6, let me get ahead of myself to say, we're going to see how forceful a preacher and teacher Ezekiel was in presenting his message. And of course, this is not his just dreaming up. I think I'll illustrate it this way. God's telling him how to do this. But this also, he's illustrating and vividly picturing what's going on and illustrates it by these parables that God has told him to perform. All right, those are the 4 symbolic parables. Let's move now to the 2nd section. And if you're following on your handout, you're on the back side now. Let's talk about the reasons for this severe punishment or judgment. So what did we learn if we summarize the first section, those 4 things? What we've learned from that is God is going to bring judgment on Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to fall, despite what the prophets say. They're going into captivity, symbolized by the second of those. You're going to go eat polluted bread in captivity, demonstrated by the third. And some of you are going to die by the sword, some by the pestilence, and some are going to be scattered. Jerusalem is going to fall. No doubt about it. I, the Lord, has spoken it. We're going to see that in chapter 5. Why is now the question. Why did all this happen? So let's see. 3 things. He said, because you have not obeyed, verses 5 through 10. Let's work through that. Beginning at verse 5, thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem I have set in the midst of her nations and the countries all around her. Now this is quite interesting to me. I've on a cursory reading of this, and if it's been a while, and it has been a while since I had taught Ezekiel or preached from Ezekiel, I've forgotten some of the statements here, that what I'm expecting to read is, you've disobeyed, and okay, I know what he's going to say. He's going to say they disobeyed. But it's a little surprising that he says here, and I want you to watch for this if you hadn't already caught it, if you hadn't read ahead, that you're worse than nations that are heathens around you. There are heathen nations doing better than you are. There's something practical in that. Let's see. So at verse 6 he said, she has rebelled against my judgment by doing wickedness more than the nations, and against my statutes more than the countries that are all around her. For they refuse my judgments, and they have not walked in my statutes. Well, that's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. That the nations are around you that are heathen nations are better than you. Is that saying they were not wicked? No, it's not saying they were not wicked. They're better in the sense that they are more allegiant to their God than you are to your God. They're more faithful to their idols than you are to your God. They're more dedicated and devoted to their religion than you are. They're more consistent than you are. And so they are living better than you are in that sense. Perhaps other parallels could be drawn. So let's look at verse 7. Therefore, thus says the Lord, because you have multiplied disobedience more than the nations all around you. I want you to look at that phrase, multiplied disobedience. It's like you take disobedience times and you multiply it by large numbers. In other words, you just made it and you just multiply it and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Y'all, that's compounding disobedience. And notice again, he says, more than all the nations that are around you, nor have you kept my judgments, nor even done according to the judgments of the nations that are around you. They've done better about some things than you have. That's pretty sad. I've got a question we're going to pause and deal with on the handout here in a moment about that. You might look ahead and be thinking on that. Now notice at verse 8 through verse 10 now. We're still in this, they have not obeyed. But at verse 8 now, he said, this is how severe it's going to be. So what verses 5, 6, and 7 is telling us in this, you haven't obeyed, is that you didn't obey and the nations around you did better than you. How severe is this punishment going to be? How bad is it? I, even the Lord, am against you, will execute judgments in your midst, in your sight. And notice now verse 9, I will do among you what I have never done, and the like of which I'll never do again, because of all your abominations. I'm going to do something to this nation that I haven't done before, and I'm going to do something that I'll probably never do again. I don't know, but I believe when I was a child, if my dad said, I'm not to discipline you in a way I've never done before, and I'll probably never do it again, I believe I'd be a little bit afraid. Wouldn't you? Look at verse 10. Therefore fathers shall eat their sons in their midst, and their sons shall eat their fathers, and I will execute judgments among you. Of all who remain, I will scatter to all the winds. I think he's describing, is that literally that father was eating son, son eating his father, father eating his son? Perhaps so. There was some of that. It may be more descriptive of, it's just the morals have so deteriorated and the situation is so severe, this is how bad it's got. And because of that, I'm going to scatter you to the winds. Now let's pick up at verse 11. Let's go to verse 11. Verse 11 seems to be pointing out, and I put it as a standalone verse, they don't seem to be serious about spiritual matters. How so? Therefore, as I live, says the Lord, because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable things, their idolatry, etc., corrupting the temple. That shows they were not serious about serving God. You're not serious about your religion. And that's perhaps one of the ways in which the nations were better. They were serious about their religion. Some of them were, not all of them, but they're serious about their religion. More dedicated to their cause. You're not dedicated at all. You defiled the sanctuary. You did detestable things with all your abominations. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. Now verse 12 beginning. Let's get 12 to 17. Here's the consequence of all of your action. So what he's done so far is, you were disobedient. The like of which I've not seen before, I'm going to punish you. Here's the consequence. And one of the questions we have is, what are some of the consequences? Let's see if we can find those. Also, though, one of the things on your handout is, how does verse 12 explain the signs that we saw in the first 4 signs? Well, let's see. 1/3 of you will die of the pestilence and be consumed with a famine in your midst. So the third of the hair that was thrown into the fire suggests they're going to die of pestilence and of famine. So that's going to take care of 1/3. And 1/3 will fall by a sword all around you. So 1/3 is going to die in battle or fall by the battle. So that's what that represents. And I will scatter another 1/3 to all the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them. So of those that are scattered, I'm going to draw out a sword after them. So he said here, so tell me again, Ezekiel, what you were doing with the hair, and you divided it into 3 sections, and you threw some of it in the midst of the fire, and in the city, in the middle of the city, and you took 1/3 of it and you hacked it up with a sword, and the other 1/3 you scattered the wind. What was that all about? 1/3's going to die by pestilence or famine, 1/3 by sword, and 1/3 are going to be scattered. So in other words, in the siege in Jerusalem, some are going to die of starvation, some are going to be killed with a sword, and some are going to be scattered. That's his point. Here's my explanation, is what Ezekiel is saying. Now beginning at verse 13, let's start watching for consequences. Thus shall my anger be spent, and I will cause my fury to rest upon them, and I will be avenged. You might underline, I will be avenged. Here's a lesson you're going to learn from the prophets. When God punishes people for sin, God is avenged. What a powerful lesson to learn. God is vindicated. God is avenged. God is, His glory, His majesty is illuminated when he punishes sin. If God states a law and then man violates it and God doesn't do anything, then that says a great deal about God being a weak God. God is avenged when his fury is poured out. And so he said, I will be avenged. That's an interesting phrase. Now, we haven't come across this phrase yet. We've talked about it and got ahead. But so far in 1 to 3 and up to, we're at chapter 5, we haven't seen this phrase that then shall they know that I'm the Lord. But he hints at that concept right here at verse 13. Then shall they know that I, the Lord, have spoken it. In other words, when my fury is poured out, they'll know that I spoke it. What's he talking about? God says, I'm going to punish Jerusalem, and when Jerusalem is punished, they're going to know that I said it. I said it, and it came to pass. All right, let's go further. Look at verse 14. Moreover, I will make you a waste and a reproach among all the nations that are better than you. You're going to be a taunt song among them. And you shall be a reproach and a taunt and a lesson, a warning, the English Standard says. You're going to be a warning to other nations. In other words, if Judah was punished like this because they disobeyed God, what about this nation over here? They're going to be punished too. It's going to be served as a warning. Now look again at verse 13. I want you to see all three times he says this. At verse 13, now at end of verse 15, that when I execute judgments with my anger and my fury, that I, the Lord, have spoken it. You're going to know that. And I'm going to send destruction, verse 16, and cut off your supply of bread, which was demonstrated in the third of the signs. And so verse 17, when I've sent wild beast and famine among you, and the pestilence and blood shall pass through you, and I'll bring a sword against you, and I, the Lord, have spoken it. There's the third time he said it. I spoke it, and I said it was going to be done. It's going to be done. And when it comes to pass, he's going to tell us in the next chapter, then you'll know I'm the Lord. All right. Now let's go to chapter 6 now. Chapter 6 and 7 deals with the devastation of the land that's going on. So basically, you have the demonstration with the signs. What chapter 5 basically said, or most of chapter 5 said, here's the reason, their sins. And here's how bad it's going to be. Here's the consequence of that. Now there's going to be destruction upon the land, and there's going to be a remnant spared. The idolaters are going to fall by their idols. In other words, the idols can't spare them. We're going to see that. Then they'll know that I'm the Lord. I want us to go back, though, to our handout just for a moment and pause before we go to chapter 6. The first long box there across the page, how could people of the world or denominationalism do better than us? I think there's a lesson to be learned here. The people of the world sometimes can do better than us. People of denominationalism can do better than us. How so? Well, I know of several religious people that are more dedicated to their cause than we are, perhaps. You take the Jehovah's Witnesses, they're more evangelistic than us. And so are the Mormons. They're more dedicated to teaching their cause, perhaps, than we are. At least some of us, at least. There are people in denominationalism that are as faithful as they can be to what they believe and to their cause. Some among us sometimes are very lacking in diligence. And so just because we believe the right doctrine, stand for the truth, or agree with the truth, doesn't mean we're living as we ought to be. Sometimes people of the world can outshine us. People of denominationalism can outshine us. They may be more dedicated, more devoted. Sometimes the people of the world have higher standards of morals than we do. In other words, they don't use some of the language we use. They wouldn't go to the dances we would go to. They wouldn't watch some of the movies we would watch. They have higher standards. They're of the world, but they may have higher standards than we have. And so sometimes they do outshine us. So now let's go to chapter 6. Let's talk about the devastation coming on the land. Verses 1 to 7, the destruction is decreed upon the land. Let's see what happens in 1 to 6. He said, Son of man, set your face toward the mountains of Israel. I'm at verse 2. And prophesy against them. So when all of this scene of the demonstrations of chapter 4 are going on, during that time and beyond, you set your face toward the mountains of Jerusalem and you prophesy against them. And you say at verse 3, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord. Indeed, I will bring a sword against you, and I will destroy your high places. Talking about what's going to go on in Jerusalem. I'm going to destroy your high places. All that idolatry is going to be destroyed. Your altars will be desolate. And I will lay your corpse of the children of Israel before the idols, and I will scatter the bones before the idols. Now look at verse 6. There's something we learned from verse 6. You got a question on this. In all your dwelling places in the city will be laid waste, and your high places be desolate, so that your altars may be laid waste and made desolate. Your idols may be broken and made to cease, and your incense altars may be cut down, and your works may be abolished. In other words, what's going to happen to all those idols, seats of idols, and the idolatry, and all your idols, they're going to be destroyed. That means your idols didn't do you any good. They're worthless gods. And so what that demonstrates is that they did not know that the God of heaven was their ruler. So we're about to see 3 times in this chapter, then shall they know that I'm the Lord. Found 63 times in the book. We're going to see 3 of those here tonight. So why does that need to be driven home? Because they did not know the Lord was their ruler. They had turned to idols. They turned to Egypt for help. As we saw in the book of Isaiah and the book of Jeremiah, they were looking for help elsewhere, but their idols are worthless. Your idols are going to be destroyed in the siege. And so all those seats of idols, they can't spare you at all. They're going to be destroyed. And the idolaters are going to be falling there before them. Now notice at verse 7 to finish that first section 3a on the screen. He said, the slain shall fall in your midst. And when that happens, here's the conclusion you might underline. Then shall you know that I'm the Lord. I'll try to call attention to all 63 as we go through. That's the first of the 63. Then shall they know that I'm the Lord. In other words, when Jerusalem falls and the idols fall over and the idols are destroyed, then you're going to know I'm the Lord. You don't know that yet. You haven't understood that yet. You can say you do, but you don't. You're going to know I'm the Lord. Now, beginning at verse 8 through verse 10, a remnant's going to be spared. Here's a practical lesson to learn. There always has been, there always will be a remnant. All through the prophets, all through the New Testament, God has always promised there will be a remnant. And so I'm footnoting here. I'm not following the text. I'm footnoting here. When you hear someone talk about the church is diminishing, it may. Back a number of years ago, the rate of the church declining was at such, predictions made among some of our brethren was by the year of 2000 there wouldn't be a Christian left on the face of the earth. I don't believe that. We're still here, aren't we? We're still here 23 years later. I don't think it would ever happen because there always has been, there always will be a remnant. This is the kingdom that shall not be destroyed. Daniel 2:44. Always has been, always will be. Now notice at verse 8 now. I will leave a remnant so that you may have some who escape the sword among the nations when you are scattered through the countries. So a remnant's going to be left, and they're going to be scattered. And of those that escape will remember me among the nations where they're carried, because I was crushed by their adulterous heart which has departed from me, and by their eyes that play the harlot before their idols. Now notice that, what God says. When I saw them go after idolatry, I was crushed as a husband is crushed when he sees his wife go after harlotry. When she became a harlot. Or just as a woman is crushed when she sees her husband go after a harlot. He said, my heart was crushed when I saw you turn to idolatry. This is how God feels when we sin. So you think, well, that wasn't that bad of a sin. When we commit sin willfully, God is crushed. He feels like we've committed adultery. And he said, I was bothered by their eyes which played the harlot. I was bothered that they were making eyes at idols. Not literally, but they're looking over at idols and are interested in idols. And he said, they were cheating on me. That's how I felt. And then notice at verse 10 now. He says, and they shall know that I'm the Lord, and that I have not said in vain that I would bring the calamity upon them. The Lord meant what he said. He always does. When we know that God is the Lord, we know that he means what he says. And so when I said idolatry was wrong, I meant idolatry is wrong. When I said you were not to go after idols, you're not to go after idols. When I said I would punish you if you went after idolatry, I meant what I said. Now the last section, 11 to 14. The idolaters shall fall by their idols. In other words, the idols are going to be destroyed, but so are you too. Now, this is quite interesting here. At verse 11, I think I have a question about this. Maybe I didn't. Down at the bottom of your handout, what do we learn about Ezekiel's preaching from verse 11? Notice this. He said, pound your fist and stamp your feet. Strike your hands, the footnote literally says. In other words, Ezekiel, don't go out there and tell the people, you know what, y'all shouldn't be committing idolatry. But he's saying what you do is you tell them, stop it. That's wrong, that's sinful. You stop that sin. You hammer down. You strike your hand, you stamp your feet, you get their attention, you tell them how sinful their behavior is. And so you strike your hands. You pound your fist about that. You get their attention. In other words, Ezekiel, get vigorous in your preaching and let them know. Let them know what you're talking about. Get their attention. Be enthusiastic in the delivery of your message. Let them know how important that is. How the message is delivered has everything to do with its impact. And you do that. So, at verse 11, for they shall fall by the sword and by the famine. So I want you to notice at verse 12, he that is far away and he that is near shall fall by the sword. But then at verse 13, you might underline, then shall they know that I'm the Lord, when their slain men are among their idols around their altars and on every hill and on every mountain. They're going to know I'm the Lord when the idolaters are being crushed and they're dying right by their altars. They're standing by their altars and the idolater's dying. They're going to know I'm the Lord. Because I said it was going to happen. And notice he said, I will stretch out my hand against them at verse 12 to make the land desolate. And notice he ends at verse 14, then shall they know that I'm the Lord. In other words, the Lord's going to turn these scenes that where incense was burned. Notice he mentions that at the end of verse 13, that they're going to die wherever they offered sweet incense to their idols. The sweet smell of incense is going to turn to the stench of death. If you can imagine the scene where they were offering incense to their idols, what a sweet-smelling aroma that was. There's going to be the smell of death there, God said. That's what's going to happen. That's what's going to take place. And that's what's going to happen to Israel, or to Jerusalem, rather. All right. Let's go to our handout just for a moment. What does verse 10 say about God's Word? If we didn't catch that as we come through, what we're seeing in verse 10 is God means what He says. And what God is saying is, I said it was going to come to pass, and I meant it was going to come to pass. I said idolatry was wrong, and I meant idolatry was wrong. And what God is saying, and this may be something that would be startling for us to learn in the day of judgment, that what we thought He really didn't mean, we know what He said, but we didn't think He was serious. God may say, I meant what I said. I said that was wrong, and it was wrong. I gave you a command, and I meant that. What a powerful, powerful thing to learn. Our time is gone. We're going to stop there and pick up with chapter 7 next time.